He was the son of a decorated war hero, a married man with children of his own, and yet, in the autumn of 1977, the streets of Moscow became his hunting ground, and the most innocent souls imaginable became his prey. Welcome to True Crime Headquarters. Tonight, we examine 3 disturbing cases where the real story lurked behind what initially seemed entirely innocent. Every piece of this story was built on thorough research, verified facts, and a deep commitment to getting it right. No detail was chosen carelessly. Each one carries the significance of the true events behind it. The purpose of this channel is simple: to make sure history like this is never allowed to disappear. Now, please take a moment to settle in. Breathe slowly. Let the outside world fade. This is the story of the empty stroller. Anatoly Nikolaevich Biryakov, aka the Baby Hunter, the Soviet monster the state tried to bury. Now let's begin. Somewhere in this world, there exists a category of evil so monstrous, so incomprehensibly savage, that even the most hardened investigators who have spent decades staring into the abyss of human cruelty will pause, set down their files, and need a moment before they can continue reading. Anatoly Nikolaevich Biryakov belongs to that category. He was not a ghost. He was not a myth whispered between frightened Muscovites on cold autumn nights, though that is precisely what he became. He was a real man, flesh and bone, a husband, a father, a man who walked the same streets as everyone else, breathed the same frigid Moscow air, passed the same storefronts, and nodded at the same neighbors. And then, with a calmness that defies every moral instinct the human mind possesses, he pushed a stolen stroller away from a crowd of unsuspecting people and carried a defenseless infant to their death. 5 times, in 33 days, targeting children so young they could not cry out loud enough to be saved, so small they could not fight, so new to the world that they had not yet learned its danger, and they never would. The Soviet state, drunk on its own propaganda that socialism bred no criminals, buried this story under layers of silence and political shame. The killer's father was a general, a hero of the Soviet Union, a man decorated for protecting his country. His son used that same country as a playground for slaughter, and the state looked away, until it could not anymore. This is the true, documented, bone-chilling account of the man Moscow tried to forget. The man who stalked prams and ended lives before they had a chance to begin. This is the story of the Baby Hunter. Please, if you enjoy listening and would like to find this channel again, you're welcome to subscribe. To understand the darkness, you must first understand the light it hid inside of. Anatoly Nikolaevich Biryakov entered the world on the 18th of February 1939 in the town of Lopasnya, a quiet, unremarkable settlement in Moscow Oblast that would later be renamed Chekhov. The Soviet Union in 1939 was not a place of tenderness. It was a machine grinding itself forward on ideology, fear, and the iron will of men who believed suffering was the price of progress. Children were born into a world that demanded loyalty above love, duty above desire, and silence above all else. Anatoly was born into that world, and into a family that embodied its every contradiction. His father was Nikolai Biryakov. That name meant something. In the Soviet Union, where war was the ultimate crucible of masculine worth, Nikolai Biryakov had been forged into legend. He served with distinction during the catastrophic, world-altering violence of the Second World War, what the Soviets called the Great Patriotic War, a conflict that consumed tens of millions of lives across Eastern Europe and the Soviet heartland. Nikolai did not merely survive that war. He distinguished himself within it, earning the highest honor the Soviet state could bestow upon a living soldier, hero of the Soviet Union. By the time Anatoly was growing up, his father held the rank of general in the Soviet army. In a country where rank was religion, That meant the Biryakov family existed on a different plane from ordinary Soviet citizens. They had access. They had prestige. They had the invisible but very real shield of institutional protection that surrounded all men of influence in the Soviet system. What does it do to a child to grow up in the shadow of an almost mythological father? What does it feel like to carry a name weighted with honor, to be the son of a man who fought in one of history's most brutal conflicts and emerged decorated, respected, celebrated, while you are simply Anatoly, a boy in Moscow, expected to carry that greatness forward? History has no record of young Anatoly's childhood interior life. The Soviet system did not concern itself with the psychological landscape of its citizens' childhoods. There were no memoirs published, no court-ordered psychiatric deep dives that ever became public. What is known is the surface. He grew up, he became a man, he married, he fathered his own children. He built, from the outside, the architecture of a respectable Soviet life. And behind it, something rotted. The nature of that rot has never been fully explained to the public record. The Soviet state, for reasons that will become devastatingly clear as this story progresses, was not interested in producing explanations. They were interested in erasure. But what the records do confirm is that by the autumn of 1977, Anatoly Nikolaevich Biryakov, a 38-year-old married father living in Moscow, had developed an obsession so dark, so incompatible with any standard of human feeling, that it would lead him to commit acts that even seasoned Soviet investigators, men who had seen the worst of human behavior during and after the war years, described as among the most disturbing crimes they had ever encountered. Moscow in 1977 was a city of controlled surfaces. The Soviet capital was the showcase of the communist world, the monument to what the regime wanted the world to believe it had built. Wide boulevards swept between enormous Stalinist buildings. Red banners hung from institutional facades. The metro system gleamed. Parades moved with military precision. On the surface, Moscow was a city of order, of civic pride, of collective purpose. Crime, in the official Soviet narrative, was not a feature of socialist society. It was a relic of capitalism, a disease of the Western world that socialism had cured. The Soviet state's newspapers did not carry detailed crime reports the way Western press did. Murders happened, of course they happened, but they were handled quietly, processed through a justice system that operated largely out of public view, and filed away without the kind of public scrutiny that might destabilize the ideological fiction that the USSR had transcended the uglier impulses of human nature. This civic myth had a very specific consequence for what was about to happen. When Anatoly Biryakov began his crimes in September of 1977, the population of Moscow had no framework for what a serial killer was. They had no true crime culture, no warning campaigns, no public discourse about predatory criminality. Soviet parents left their children in prams outside shops, a completely standard practice of the era, both in the Soviet Union and across much of Europe at the time. A mother dashing inside a store for a few minutes while her baby waited in a pram on the pavement was not negligence. It was normality. It was trust. Trust in the community, trust in the safety of socialist streets, trust in the lie the state had been telling them for decades. That in the USSR citizens had nothing to fear from one another. Anatoly Biryakov understood that trust. He counted on it. He weaponized it. The autumn of 1977 arrived with the particular crispness that Moscow autumns carry. Golden leaves turning brittle on wide boulevards, the smell of cold creeping into the air, the city's rhythms settling into the indoor pace of the colder months ahead. People wore heavier coats. Mothers wrapped their babies more carefully before venturing out. Life moved at its ordinary pace, unaware that something had already begun to stir in the mind of a man moving through those streets with purpose. What drove Biryakov to infants specifically is a question that circles the case like a shadow with no resolution. Court documents noted a condition described in clinical terms that pointed toward a disturbing psychological fixation. But the Soviet court system was not a place of deep public psychiatric exploration. The regime had its verdict to reach, its narrative to control, its need to close a case that embarrassed powerful people. The deeper forensic psychology of what produced Anatoly Biryakov was never given the kind of rigorous public examination it might have received in another justice system, in another country, in another era. What the records do confirm is this: he watched. Before he acted, he observed. He identified locations. He noted patterns. He understood the rhythm of a mother's brief departure, the window of vulnerability, the moments when a pram left outside a shop door became accessible. He was not impulsive. He was deliberate. And that deliberateness is one of the most disturbing elements of the entire case. The cold, premeditated calculation behind crimes directed at the most helpless human beings alive. Biryakov was also operating within a particular psychological reality specific to the Soviet Union of that era. He had every reason to believe, consciously or unconsciously, that the system would protect him. His father was a general. His family name carried weight. In a society where institutional connection was the closest thing to armor a citizen could wear, Anatoly Biryakov wore his father's reputation like a second skin. Whether that sense of protection emboldened him, whether it fed the particular arrogance that allowed him to operate in broad daylight in the middle of Moscow, that remains one of the haunting unanswered questions of this case. What is certain is that by mid-September of 1977, he had made his decision. He had chosen his target. He had selected his method, and Moscow, beautiful, disciplined, falsely safe Moscow, had no idea what was walking its streets. The city went about its days. Mothers pushed prams. Shops opened and closed. The metro hummed. The flags waved. And Anatoly Biryakov walked and watched and waited for his moment. He did not have to wait long. September 16, 1977 was a Thursday, an ordinary working day in the Soviet capital, unremarkable in every external way. The streets of the district near Marshal Biryuzov Street carried their usual foot traffic. Citizens moved between errands. Shops served their queues. And somewhere in that ordinary human flow, a mother made the brief, unremarkable, completely reasonable decision to step inside an infant formula store for a matter of minutes, leaving her baby's pram just outside the door, as thousands of Moscow mothers did every day without incident. Anatoly Biryakov was there. He saw. He acted. By the time that mother walked back out of the shop, the pram was gone. What followed in those initial hours after the disappearance belongs to a register of human anguish that no words can fully reach. A mother returning to an empty spot on the pavement. The first seconds of confusion. Had someone moved the pram? Was this a mistake? Was she looking in the wrong place? And then, almost immediately, the realization that something is profoundly, catastrophically wrong. The screaming, the running, the search, the desperate, escalating terror of a parent whose child has vanished from a public street in the middle of a bright autumn day. The empty pram was found later that same day. It had been abandoned in the hallway of an apartment building on the same street, Marshal Biryuzov Street, stripped of its passenger. And the baby was found too, dead. In that same hallway, in that same building, the infant had been murdered. The investigation that launched was conducted under a suffocating pressure that investigators would later describe as unlike anything they had previously experienced. Not just the pressure of a heinous crime demanding resolution, but pressure from above. Political pressure, institutional pressure, the kind of pressure that only descends when powerful people have reason to be nervous. For now, in those first chaotic hours and days, the investigators worked what they had. A dead infant, an abandoned pram, a street full of people who had seen nothing, or who believed they had seen nothing, because what they might have seen was too ordinary to register as dangerous. A man, walking with a pram, in Moscow, in 1977. Nothing unusual about that at all. Nothing at all. That is the specific, suffocating genius of what Biryakov had understood. He was invisible because he was ordinary. He moved through the world carrying the camouflage of normalcy. A man with a pram was not a threat. A man with a pram was a father. A man with a pram was a citizen, a husband, a productive member of Soviet society doing something so mundane, so universal, so disarming that not a single person who watched him walk past registered any alarm. He had chosen the perfect disguise. And in a society where trust in one's neighbors had been ideologically mandated for decades, that disguise was essentially impenetrable. 3 days. That is how long Anatoly Biryakov waited before he went out again. 3 days of Moscow continuing its ordinary existence. 3 days of an investigation working frantically and quietly, away from any public eye, because the Soviet state did not publish news of infant murders. 3 days of a mother who could not sleep, who could not eat, who could not understand what had reached into her ordinary Thursday and torn out everything that mattered. 3 days of Anatoly Biryakov living his life, eating, sleeping, walking the city, carrying the knowledge of what he had done with a composure that defies every instinct of guilt and horror a person is supposed to feel. On the 19th of September 1977, 3 days after the first murder, he went back out. The Children's World store on Prospect Mira is one of Moscow's most enduring landmarks. A vast, grand department store dedicated to the goods of childhood, its name dripping with an innocence that makes what happened outside it on September 19th, 1977 all the more devastating. Prospect Mira, Avenue of Peace, is one of the city's great arterial roads, wide and busy and lined with the architectural confidence of the Soviet capital at what it imagined was its height. It was not a quiet back street. It was not a dark corner. It was a busy, populated, very public space in the middle of one of the most watched cities on earth. None of that mattered to Anatoly Biryakov. On that September morning, a mother had left her pram outside the Children's World store. Inside it lay her daughter, 3 months old. 3 months. A human being so new to existence that she would have measured her life not in years or months but in the particular sensory vocabulary of infancy. Warmth, cold, hunger, comfort, the smell of her mother's skin, the sound of familiar voices. 3 months old. Too young to know danger was close. Too young to understand that the shadow falling over her pram was not her mother returning. Biryakov took the pram. He took the child. He walked away. The disappearance of a second infant from the streets of Moscow within 3 days of the first sent ripples through the investigative apparatus that were impossible to contain. The Moscow police were not naive men. They understood immediately, with the second infant gone, that they were no longer dealing with an isolated incident. The word that investigators reached for, the word they almost certainly dreaded reaching for, because it carried implications so catastrophic for the Soviet Union's self-image, was serial. A serial perpetrator. Someone who was doing this deliberately, repeatedly, with targeting and method and the apparent willingness to continue. What followed was one of the largest police operations in Moscow's history, a mobilization of investigative resources and street-level surveillance that the Soviet system could deploy with considerable force when sufficiently motivated. Plainclothes officers positioned near shops. Surveillance of busy pedestrian areas. Interviews conducted door to door. The entire machinery of Soviet law enforcement cranked into urgent motion. And still silence. No suspect emerged. No credible witness came forward. The city kept moving, oblivious to the fact that a major operation was underway, because the state said nothing publicly. Not a word appeared in Pravda. Not a line was broadcast on state radio. The mothers of Moscow continued the practice of leaving their prams outside shops, because they had no reason to believe it was dangerous. How could they? The state had told them nothing. This silence was not incompetence. It was policy, and it was policy driven, at least in part, by the name Biryakov. Anatoly's father, General Nikolai Biryakov, was not merely a retired officer with a good service record. He was a decorated hero of the Soviet Union, a man the state had publicly honored, a symbol of the generation that had saved the USSR from Nazi destruction. To announce publicly that his son was a serial killer of infants, to put that name in a headline, to connect that heroic surname to crimes so monstrous that they shook even hardened investigators, was unthinkable to the Soviet authorities. Not just politically uncomfortable, genuinely, structurally unthinkable. The system did not have a mechanism for that kind of honesty. It had a mechanism for suppression, and it deployed that mechanism with its full customary efficiency. The consequence was a city full of vulnerable children and parents who did not know they needed to be afraid. Meanwhile, the second victim, the 3-month-old girl taken from outside the Children's World store on Prospect Mira, had not yet been found. Days passed. The investigation spread outward from the city center in widening circles. Officers combed districts, checked wasteland, examined the spaces between Moscow's ordered public face and the forgotten edges where the city dissolved into peripheral rubble and overgrown lots. It was grim, painstaking, and desperate work, conducted under the clock of the fear that the perpetrator would strike again before they found him. Biryakov did not wait for them. The exact sequence of the 3 additional victims attributed to him during this period is not documented in precise public detail. The Soviet state's deliberate suppression of the case means the granular timeline was never fully reconstructed in any form accessible to the public. What the records confirm is that across September and October of 1977, 5 infants in total were killed. 3 additional victims beyond the first 2 are documented as attributable to Biryakov, committed within the same compressed window of weeks. Each one was a baby. Each one was taken from a pram left momentarily unattended. Each one was murdered. 5 children, 5 families, 5 moments on ordinary days when the world simply ended. The particular cruelty embedded in Biryakov's method of target selection is not something that diminishes with repetition. It intensifies. Every time this man walked out into the streets of Moscow, he was looking for a specific kind of vulnerability. An unguarded pram, a momentarily absent parent, a window of seconds in which a small life was exposed and available. He was not driven by rage in the heat of confrontation. He was not ambushing adults in moments of anger. He was hunting deliberately, patiently, specifically, for the most defenseless human beings that exist. Newborns, infants, children who weighed perhaps a handful of kilograms, who had not yet developed the motor control to move under their own power, who could not scream in a way that would carry above the ambient noise of a city street. The word hunter sits in this case with a weight that feels almost unbearable. It was used by the Soviet investigators. It became his name in the criminal record, the baby hunter. It is not a dramatic invention for effect. It is the stripped-down, accurate description of what he did. He went out. He hunted. He returned. October arrived, and Moscow's autumn deepened into the first cold warnings of the winter ahead. Somewhere in the fabric of that city, the second victim lay waiting to be found. On October 17, 1977, nearly 4 weeks after the 3-month-old girl had been taken from outside the Children's World store, investigators found her body. It had been deposited in a landfill near Mamirov, a village on the outskirts of Moscow, in the peripheral geography of the city where the ordered urban space surrendered to something less controlled, less watched. The condition of the body told a story that hardened even the most seasoned investigators. She showed unmistakable signs of sexual assault before her death. That finding changed the nature of the case in a way that is important to understand clearly, because it is one of the most disturbing and significant forensic details of the entire investigation. Biryakov had not merely killed these children. He had violated them. The crime had layers of depravity stacked on each other. The kidnapping of an infant too young to comprehend what was happening, the sexual assault, and then the murder. Each element alone would constitute a crime of staggering severity. Together, they painted a portrait of a mind operating in a register of evil that investigators struggled to categorize, in a system that didn't have established frameworks for this level of predatory behavior directed at infants. The Soviet investigators pushed harder. Patrols were intensified. The geographic radius of the search widened. Every available resource the Moscow police could deploy was in motion. And still Biryakov remained invisible because he remained ordinary, because he walked and watched and blended perfectly into the fabric of a city that had been told nothing was wrong. It is worth sitting for a moment with what it means that Biryakov continued to live his daily life alongside these crimes. He went home. He sat at a table. He perhaps helped his own children with something. He moved through the ordinary rhythms of Soviet family life, the shared meals, the evening hours, the morning routines, while carrying the knowledge of what he had done in those stolen windows of time when he stepped outside and became something else entirely. The compartmentalization required for that is not simply a psychological curiosity. It is its own form of horror. The ability to separate the domestic surface from the predatory interior, to maintain both simultaneously without apparent rupture, is one of the qualities that makes certain killers so devastatingly difficult to identify and so deeply disturbing to contemplate once identified. He did not show his nature. He wore his life like a costume over it. And then came October 24th, 1977. Biryakov made a decision that day that deviated from the geography of his previous crimes. He traveled south of Moscow to Chekhov, the city in Moscow Oblast that had previously been called Lopasnya, the city of his birth. Whether that geographic choice carried any psychological significance, whether it was deliberate or simply opportunistic, has never been established. What is established is that he attempted another kidnapping there. It did not go as planned. Something went wrong, some element of the attempt that broke the invisible bubble of his operational invisibility. He was seen. People gave chase. Citizens, ordinary Soviet residents of Chekhov, acting on the basic human instinct to stop what looked wrong, ran after him. He was pursued. And in the chaotic aftermath of that pursuit, the witnesses did what witnesses do when they are frightened and outraged and capable of being heard. They described him to investigators. Clearly enough to matter. Clearly enough to move the investigation to its next critical phase. October 24th, 1977. The day Anatoly Biryakov was caught. The arrest, when it came, happened quickly, the machinery of Soviet law enforcement moving with its full institutional weight once a clear lead had materialized. He was taken into custody, and with his arrest, Moscow, or rather, the investigators working the case, finally had their man. The baby hunter was behind bars. The city still did not know. The state said nothing. The interrogation of Anatoly Nikolaevich Biryakov took place inside a Soviet system that was, by its very design, opaque to the outside world. There were no press briefings. There were no leaked court documents circulating in newspapers. There was no army of journalists camped outside the building where investigators sat across a table from the man who had killed 5 infants in 33 days. There was the system, and the system worked in silence, and the silence was as much a part of the state's response to this case as any legal process. What the investigators now possessed was a confession and the weight of evidence accumulated across weeks of painstaking forensic work. The body at the landfill near Mamirov, the abandoned prams, the witnesses in Chekhov, the accumulated physical trail of a man who had moved through Moscow believing, with some justification, that the shield of his father's name would protect him from the full consequence of what he was doing. That belief, it turned out, had its limits. The investigators who worked the Biryakov case did so under a specific and unusual pressure. The pressure of the name attached to the suspect. Nikolai Biryakov, general, hero of the Soviet Union, decorated veteran of the Great Patriotic War, was Anatoly's father. And in the Soviet Union of 1977, that connection was not a neutral biographical detail. It was a pressure point, complication, a reason for the apparatus of the state to want this handled as quietly and as quickly and as completely invisibly as possible. This was not merely about protecting one family's reputation. It was about protecting the narrative. The Soviet state had spent decades building and maintaining a very specific story about itself. That socialism was morally superior to capitalism, that a socialist society produced better citizens, that the evils of predatory criminality were byproducts of capitalist exploitation and had no place in the workers' paradise. Serial killers were not supposed to exist in the USSR. The very concept was ideologically inconvenient. And a serial killer who was the son of a national hero, that was not merely inconvenient. That was the kind of story capable of cracking the ideological facade in ways the regime could not afford to permit. So the case was processed in the shadow. No public announcement, no press coverage, no warning to Moscow's parents that a man had been caught who had spent 5 weeks stealing their children from pavements and killing them. The city simply continued, unknowing, and the investigators worked in their sealed, pressure-cooked environment, building the legal case that would determine Anatoly Biryakov's fate. What emerged from those interrogations revealed a picture of a man with no remorse. That is perhaps the element most investigators and legal professionals involved in the case found the most difficult to reconcile with the external presentation of the man before them. He was not raving. He was not incoherent. He was not the wild-eyed monster of popular imagination, the kind of figure whose evil reads legibly on the surface. He was composed, functional, coherent, a man capable of full sentences, rational responses, and ordinary-seeming human interaction. The same man who had walked the streets of Moscow in the autumn of 1977 as a ghost hiding inside the body of a regular citizen. The question of his psychological state was examined within the Soviet legal and psychiatric framework of the era. A framework that served the state's conclusions rather than pursuing truth for its own sake. The Soviet psychiatric system was notorious, particularly during this period, for diagnosing political inconvenience as mental illness when it suited the regime, and diagnosing genuine mental illness as criminal responsibility when that served state purposes. In Biryakov's case, the system moved toward the latter. He was determined to be legally responsible for his crimes. Sane in the juridical sense, capable of understanding what he had done, culpable. The investigation also worked to establish the full scope of the crimes, not just the 2 victims whose disappearances had triggered the major police operation, but the 3 additional infants whose deaths were attributed to him across the same period. Each case required its own chain of evidence, its own forensic reconstruction, its own connection to the man now sitting in custody answering questions. The work was meticulous, thorough, and conducted with the knowledge that the case, whatever the state intended for its public profile, needed to be legally airtight. The evidence assembled was overwhelming. The physical evidence, the witness testimony from Chekhov, the forensic findings from the recovered bodies, the confession, together, they built a case that left no juridical daylight for reasonable doubt. Anatoly Nikolaevich Biryakov had kidnapped and murdered 5 infants in Moscow between September 16th and approximately October 24th, 1977. That was the established, documented, court-ready reality of what he had done. In 1978, roughly a year after the crimes and the arrest, the Soviet legal system reached its verdict. Anatoly Nikolaevich Biryakov was convicted of murder with aggravating circumstances and sentenced to death. Inside the detention facility, something happened that offered a window into the mind of the condemned man that the public record rarely provides. Biryakov attempted to take his own life. The attempt failed. He was kept alive, guarded, monitored, held in the particular suspended state of a man who has been sentenced to die but not yet delivered to that sentence. The suicide attempt tells us something, though exactly what it tells us is open to interpretation. Was it an expression of genuine guilt, the mind finally cracking under the weight of what it had done? Was it the fear of what was coming, a man trying to escape the sentence before the state could carry it out? Was it something more opaque, more psychologically complex than either of those explanations? The record does not say. The record never says. What the record does say is that following his sentencing, the case was appealed to the Supreme Soviet of the RSFSR, the highest legal body in the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic. This was not unusual in Soviet capital cases. The death penalty existed in the USSR, but sentences had to be confirmed at the highest level before they could be carried out. The appeal was filed. The arguments were made. The Supreme Soviet considered the case, and the appeal was denied. The sentence was confirmed: death. Meanwhile, the full machinery of Soviet suppression continued to operate around the case. The NTV presenter Leonid Konevsky, who would later cover the Biryakov case in his true crime program decades after the fact, stated explicitly that the Soviet authorities deliberately avoided publicizing the case, and that one of the primary reasons for that suppression was the identity of Anatoly's father. General Nikolai Biryakov's reputation was a state asset in some sense, a piece of the heroic war narrative the regime maintained as one of its foundational myths. To attach that name to his son's crimes in the public forum was to damage something the state valued and had invested in protecting. The mothers of Moscow whose children had been taken never received a public acknowledgement of what had happened. The families who had buried their infants went through their grief in a society that officially pretended the crimes had not occurred. There was no public trial that citizens could follow. There was no newspaper account that validated their loss, that told the story of what had been done to their children in the clear, documented language of public record. They knew. The investigators knew. The courts knew. The state knew. But the city did not know, and the state intended to keep it that way. This element of the Biryakov case carries its own particular cruelty that operates entirely separately from the crimes themselves. The families of his victims were sentenced, in addition to the unbearable loss of their infants, to a silence imposed upon them by a state that valued its own reputation more than their grief. They could not speak publicly about what had happened. They could not seek the community of shared outrage and collective acknowledgement that allows traumatized families to begin building something like recovery. They were isolated inside their loss, surrounded by a city that did not know, maintained in that isolation by official policy. The NTV program that eventually told this story aired decades later, and it included the voice of a mother, the mother of one of the victims. That she was willing to speak years and decades after the fact in front of cameras in public tells you something about what it means to carry a grief that was never publicly acknowledged, a loss that the state tried to edit out of the record of the world. The investigators who worked the case spoke too. Men who had carried the experience of those weeks in the autumn of 1977 forward through the rest of their careers, through the collapse of the Soviet Union, through the decades of change that followed. They described the investigation's ferocious pressure. They described the unique horror of crimes directed at infants. They described the wall of institutional silence they worked behind and against simultaneously. And Biryakov's defense attorney was there. Even in the Soviet system, even in a case this clear-cut, even with a client who had confessed, the state provided legal representation. What arguments the defense made, what mitigations were attempted, what the attorney privately thought of the man he was legally obligated to represent. These details live in the record of the program and in the sealed archives of a legal system that did not invite public scrutiny. What matters is the outcome. The court had spoken. The appeal body had confirmed the sentence. The state had its verdict, even if it refused to share it with its own citizens. All that remained was the execution. The morning of the 24th of February, 1979 arrived in Moscow with no announcement. No newspaper carried the date in any context that the public would have recognized. No broadcast noted what was about to happen in a facility somewhere within the Soviet capital. The city woke and moved through its ordinary Thursday in complete ignorance of the fact that the man who had terrorized its streets, though it had never been told it was being terrorized, was about to be brought to the end of his life. The method of execution in the Soviet Union during this era was the firing squad. This was not a ceremony with witnesses and dignity and the theater of state justice that some systems use to make death feel procedural and measured. Soviet execution by firing squad was efficient, private, institutional. The condemned was brought to the appointed place. The appointed personnel carried out the sentence. The state's debt to the dead was, in its own cold accounting, settled. The body was disposed of. The file was closed. Anatoly Nikolaevich Biryakov was executed on the 24th of February, 1979. He was 40 years old. He had been born on the 18th of February, 1939, meaning he died just 6 days after what would have been his 40th birthday, in the same month he had entered the world. Whether anyone noted that grim symmetry at the time is not recorded. The system was not given to dark poetry. It had a sentence to carry out, and it carried it out. He was gone. 6 days past 40. The son of a war hero, executed by the same state his father had served with such celebrated distinction. The man who had called himself a father, who had children of his own, who had walked Moscow streets for 33 days in the autumn of 1977, taking the children of other parents and ending their lives. He was dead. But here is the thing about suppressed stories. They do not stay suppressed forever. The Soviet Union itself would not last forever. The system that had buried the Biryakov case, that had maintained its silence through the conviction and execution and disposal of the convicted killer, that had protected a general's name at the cost of every surviving family member's right to public acknowledgement, that system was living on borrowed time. The years passed. Leonid Brezhnev, whose Soviet Union had presided over the Biryakov case from beginning to end, died in 1982. The slow, grinding process of Soviet dissolution that accelerated under Gorbachev in the late 1980s moved toward its eventual terminus. In 1991, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. The Russian Federation emerged from its collapse, a different country, legally and politically, even if many of its institutions and much of its culture carried the weight of what had preceded them. In the new Russia, the media landscape changed in ways that would have been impossible in the Soviet era. Commercial television emerged. Investigative journalism developed a presence, however imperfect. True crime as a genre found an audience because Russians, like people everywhere, were drawn to the stories their former state had kept locked away. The archives of the Soviet era held thousands of stories that had been suppressed for ideological or political reasons, and the appetite to know those stories, to claim the history that had been withheld, was real and powerful. Into that landscape stepped a program called Следствие вели, roughly translatable as Investigations Led, broadcast on NTV, one of Russia's major television networks. The program covered historical crimes from the Soviet era, drawing on investigators and witnesses and surviving family members to reconstruct cases that had been buried in the official silence of the old regime. It was presented by Leonid Kanevsky, a former actor who became one of Russia's most recognized faces of true crime television. Calm, authoritative, carrying the weight of the stories he told with a gravity that the material demanded. Episode 206 of that program was titled Pustaya Kolyaska, Empty Stroller. The episode brought the Biryakov case into Russian living rooms for the first time. Into the public domain where it had always deserved to be, where the victims' families had always deserved it to exist. Kanevsky gathered the people who had been inside the story. 2 eyewitnesses to some element of the events, the mother of one of the victims, 2 state investigators who had worked the case in the autumn of 1977, and Biryakov's defense attorney. Together, on camera, they reconstructed what Moscow had been through in those 33 days. What a city had endured without knowing it was enduring it. The mother of one of the murdered infants spoke. Consider for a moment what it means to be that woman, to have buried your child in 1977, to have lived through the decades that followed carrying the knowledge of what had been done while the state maintained its wall of silence around it, to have watched the Soviet Union rise and fall and be replaced, to have grown older inside a grief that was never publicly acknowledged by anyone with the authority to acknowledge it. And then to sit in front of cameras and speak, to finally say, in a forum that would be seen by people, what happened to my child. The investigators who had worked the case in 1977 described the investigation with the perspective of men looking back across decades at something that had defined a portion of their professional lives. They described the magnitude of the operation mounted to find the perpetrator. They described the specific horror of crimes against infants. The way that particular category of victim creates a different quality of urgency in investigators, a different emotional register in the people doing the work. They were not young men when they spoke on camera. The autumn of 1977 was long behind them, but the case had not left them. Cases like this do not leave the people who work them. Kanevsky made explicit, in the program, the relationship between the case's suppression and the identity of Biryakov's father. He stated clearly that General Nikolai Biryakov's status as a decorated hero of the Soviet Union was a factor, a significant factor, in the Soviet authorities' decision to avoid public disclosure of the case. This was not speculation. This was the informed assessment of someone who had investigated the case's history, who had spoken to its participants, who had access to records and testimony that the general public had never seen. The general himself was long dead by the time the program aired. What he knew, or didn't know, about his son's crimes during his own lifetime is not part of the record. Whether the Soviet state informed him of what his son had done, whether the weight of that knowledge was something he carried, whether the Biryakov family name was a source of private agony in the years following 1977, these are questions the record cannot answer. History has preserved the official facts and left the human interior of this story largely inaccessible. What the program did accomplish was something the victims' families had been denied for decades: public acknowledgement. The crimes were now on record in the public domain, available to be known and understood and mourned appropriately. The children who had died in September and October of 1977, those 5 infants, those 5 lives that had barely begun, were finally given their place in the documented history of what had happened to them. The case also sits within a broader historical context that makes it important beyond its individual horror. The Soviet Union's denial of serial criminality was not unique to the Biryakov case. The regime maintained, as a matter of ideological policy, that serial killers were a Western phenomenon. This denial had catastrophic consequences across the Soviet era. Perpetrators operating in environments where the investigative framework for understanding their crimes was ideologically compromised, where the pressure to suppress information undermined the ability to warn potential victims, where the gap between official fiction and operational reality cost lives that might otherwise have been saved. Biryakov's case is one of the earliest documented Soviet serial killer cases of the post-war era. The cases that followed in subsequent decades, Andrei Chikatilo and others, operated in the same system and benefited from the same ideological blindness. The habit of suppression that buried the Biryakov case was the same habit that allowed other predators to operate far longer than they should have, in a system that was constitutionally unable to acknowledge what was happening within its own borders. That is the broader, structural horror layered beneath the specific, devastating horror of what Biryakov did. He did not merely kill 5 children. He did it in a system designed by its own ideological commitments to make it easier for people like him to operate and harder for investigators to stop them. The state's silence was not just a political choice made after the fact to protect a general's name. It was the expression of a deep structural denial that ran through the entire Soviet approach to crime, a denial that served no one except the criminals. The children taken in those 33 days of the autumn of 1977 deserved better than the world they were born into. They deserved parents who knew the danger. They deserved a city that had been warned. They deserved a state that valued their lives more than its own narrative. They did not get any of those things. They got an autumn afternoon on a Moscow pavement, an empty pram, and the silence that followed. Anatoly Nikolaevich Biryakov was born February 18, 1939. He was executed February 24, 1979. He killed 5 infants in 33 days in the autumn of 1977. He was known in the criminal record and in the true crime history that eventually claimed his story as the baby hunter. His crimes were buried by a state that chose its own reputation over the truth. His execution was carried out in the same secrecy that had surrounded every element of the case from the moment the first pram was found empty on Marshal Biryuzov Street. The empty stroller is the image this case leaves behind. Not the killer's face, not the courtroom, not the firing squad. The empty stroller, sitting in the hallway of a Moscow apartment building on a September afternoon, its passenger gone, the quiet around it the loudest and most terrible kind of quiet imaginable. 5 times that silence fell. 5 times Moscow's streets went on without knowing. 5 families carried the weight of a grief the state tried to erase. 5 infants, too young for names to have settled fully into the world's awareness of them, too small, too new, too utterly without the capacity for self-protection, were gone. This story was suppressed for decades. Now you know it, and once you know something like this, you carry it. The way the investigators carried it. The way the mother who sat in front of the cameras and finally spoke carried it. The way the city of Moscow carried it without knowing it was carrying it. For all those decades of silence, all those years during which the truth was sealed away in the files of a system that no longer exists, waiting for someone to open the archive and say the names out loud. The names of his victims were never made public in any record available to the world. That is the final cruelty of the silence. We know his name. We know his father's name. We know the streets, the dates, the method, the sentence, and the execution. But the children, the 5 children who were the entire reason any of this story exists, remain unnamed in the public record, protected in death by the same anonymity they were stripped of in life. Remember them anyway. If you're new here, welcome. This is a channel where true crime is told with calm and care. A huge thank you to the subscribers who've been here from the start. Your support means everything. If you're still watching, drop a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from, or just say hello. And if you haven't already, like this video and subscribe so you never miss a story. Now let's get into our second story. Story 2. The Nurse Who Played God. Petr Zelenka, aka the heparin killer, the angel of death in Ward 4. He tucked patients into their beds, spoke softly, checked their drips, and then, when nobody was looking, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a hidden vial, and turned their salvation into slow, silent slaughter. Somewhere in a quiet Czech town 100 kilometers from Prague, there was a hospital where sick people went to recover. They trusted the nurses. They trusted the needles. They trusted the hands that held their arms and pressed the plunger down. They had no reason not to. These were the people who wore the white uniforms, who answered the call buttons at 2 in the morning, who smiled through the exhaustion and said, "You are going to be fine." And most of the time, that was true. Most of the time, the medicine in that syringe was the thing standing between a patient and death. But for 17 men and women who entered the intensive care unit of Havlíčkův Brod Hospital in the year 2006, for 17 human beings who were already fighting to survive, the nurse who came to their bedside was not there to save them. He was there to conduct an experiment. And 7 of those 17 people never left that ward alive. Their bodies bled from the inside out. Their organs surrendered. Their families stood in hospital corridors, stunned and grieving, believing their loved ones had simply lost the battle with illness. Nobody suspected the quiet, reserved young man who had just been promoted to head nurse of the entire intensive care unit. Nobody looked at Petr Zelenka and saw a predator. Nobody saw the vial. Nobody saw the needle. And that, more than anything else in this story, is what makes it so deeply, disturbingly chilling. Because the monster was already inside the building, wearing scrubs, carrying a clipboard, and humming softly in the dark. There is a particular kind of danger that lives not in the shadows of alleyways or the darkness of forests, but in the fluorescent glow of hospital hallways. It wears a lanyard. It has a name badge. It knows every medication in the cabinet, every patient in every bed, and every moment when the corridor is empty enough that nobody will see what happens next. That danger, in the summer of 2006, had a name. Petr Zelenka, born on the 27th of February, 1976. In the Czech Republic, Zelenka grew up as the firstborn child in a household with high school-educated parents and a younger sister. By every external measurement, there was nothing extraordinary about his childhood. No documented trauma that made headlines. No criminal record that foreshadowed what was coming. He existed in the background of ordinary life, quiet, contained, and utterly unremarkable. He completed his nursing training and entered the healthcare profession the way thousands of other young Czechs did. Looking for stable employment, a sense of purpose, perhaps a role that carried some measure of respect within a community. He eventually secured a position at Havlíčkův Brod Hospital, a mid-sized regional facility in eastern Bohemia, serving a population of approximately 25,000 residents. The hospital was not famous. It was not cutting edge. It was simply a place where people went when their bodies failed them. And for a time, Zelenka appeared to belong there. Colleagues who later recalled their impressions of him described a man who was quiet and reserved, controlled, not warm, not particularly social, but not alarming either. He did his job. He showed up for shifts. He did not cause scenes or draw attention. In a ward filled with the constant movement of patients, doctors, equipment, and paperwork, Petr Zelenka was simply one more figure in white, present, competent, and easy to overlook. But beneath that composure, something deeply unsettling was taking shape. Some coworkers, reflecting on his behavior with the clarity that only hindsight provides, would later note that there had been something fractionally off about him. A certain detachment when dealing with patients. A controlled quality that felt less like professionalism and more like suppression, as though he was managing something internal that he never allowed to surface. He held his emotions at a distance in a way that, in most workplaces, would simply read as introversion, but in a ward where empathy was the currency of good care, it registered differently in memory. More critically, by the year 2006, Petr Zelenka had accumulated enough trust and enough professional standing within the hospital that he was promoted. Not merely promoted, elevated to the position of head nurse. He was now placed in charge of the entire intensive care unit. The intensive care unit, the place in a hospital that handles the most critically fragile human beings. The place where patients are connected to machines, sedated and immobile, utterly dependent, incapable of calling for help in any meaningful way if something goes wrong. The place where an unexpected death, while tragic, does not always trigger immediate alarm, because death in an ICU is, statistically not uncommon. This was the environment Petr Zelenka was handed authority over. And this was the environment in which he decided to act. What he did not tell his supervisors, what he told no one, carried with no one, and committed entirely within the private chamber of his own fractured reasoning, was that he had developed a specific, deeply disturbing belief about the doctors he worked alongside. He believed, with a conviction that bordered on grandiosity, that the physicians at Havlikov Broad Hospital were not good enough. He believed they were incompetent. He believed they would fail to detect signs of something wrong, even if those signs were placed directly in front of them. And somewhere in the labyrinth of his distorted thinking, he decided to prove it. Not with words, not with a complaint filed through official channels, not with a resignation or a transfer request. He decided to prove it with a hidden vial, filled with a drug called heparin, and a needle he pressed into the skin of people who had come to the hospital seeking healing. Heparin is not a poison in the traditional sense. It is a blood-thinning medication, an anticoagulant, used legitimately and routinely in hospitals across the world to prevent dangerous clotting in patients who are post-operative or at elevated cardiovascular risk. In the correct dosage, it is life-saving. It is standard. It is necessary. But administered in excess, heparin becomes something else entirely. Administered in a massive overdose, it strips the blood of its ability to clot, flooding the body with a catastrophic inability to stop its own bleeding. Internal hemorrhage begins. Organs start to fail as blood pools where it should not. The process is not instantaneous. It is not a dramatic collapse. It is a slow, unraveling deterioration, the kind that, in a patient who is already seriously ill, can appear tragically consistent with the natural progression of their condition. And that is precisely what made it so devastatingly difficult to detect. In May of 2006, Petr Zelenka slid the first concealed syringe into the first unsuspecting patient. And the experiment, as he would later call it, began. The hospital carried on as normal. Doctors wrote their notes. Nurses changed shifts. Families visited, brought flowers, asked questions in hushed voices, and received answers that were careful but delivered with medical authority. Nobody saw the small vial. Nobody noticed the extra injection. Nobody understood that, in the very building designed to protect human life, a man with a needle was working against everything that institution stood for. The weeks that followed were identical in their horror. One patient deteriorated inexplicably, then another. Blood work came back showing abnormal coagulation levels that puzzled physicians. Patients who had been stable suddenly weren't. And in those moments of confusion, those medical emergencies that required urgent intervention, that required doctors to think fast and act faster, Petr Zelenka watched. He stood among the medical team responding to the crises he had engineered. He observed. He assessed. He waited to see if anyone would figure out what he had done. They didn't, and so he did it again. 7 months is a long time. 7 months is long enough to watch the leaves shift from the pale green of late spring through the full heat of summer and into the amber melancholy of early autumn. 7 months is long enough for a hospital to lose 7 patients and absorb those deaths into the ordinary grief of institutional medicine. To write the cause of death on paperwork, to send condolences to families, to hold brief internal reviews and find no compelling reason to suspect anything other than the cruel unpredictability of severe illness. For Petr Zelenka, 7 months was exactly enough time to carry out 17 separate attacks within the walls of Havlikov Broad Hospital and remain completely undetected. The method was simple in its audacity. He carried a concealed vial of heparin, tucked away on his person, out of sight, accessible whenever the moment presented itself. He targeted patients in the intensive care unit, individuals who were already critically or seriously ill, already connected to monitoring equipment, already at elevated risk of sudden deterioration. His victims included both men and women. They were primarily elderly, though not exclusively. They shared no obvious personal connection to their attacker beyond the most terrible one of all. They had been assigned to his care. He had been entrusted with their lives, and he used that trust as access. The injections happened during periods of minimal supervision. Night shifts, when the wards were quieter and fewer eyes moved through the corridors, were particularly favorable for what he was doing. He would approach a patient. He would appear to be performing routine nursing duties. And then, with the practiced efficiency of someone who had administered thousands of legitimate injections over years of professional practice, he would deliver the overdose. The drug moved through the bloodstream silently. There was no immediate visible reaction. The patient did not cry out. The monitors did not instantly alarm. The body simply began at a cellular level to lose its capacity to contain itself. Hours later, in some cases, the patient would begin to decline. Blood would gather where it had no business gathering. The internal structures that should have been protected began to hemorrhage quietly. By the time doctors identified the crisis and responded, the damage was often irreversible. 7 times it ended in death. 10 times, through a combination of medical intervention, the individual patient's physiological resilience, or the dosage being insufficient to kill, the victim survived. Though not without suffering through a near-fatal medical catastrophe that left its mark on their bodies and their memories. The deaths were not instant. That point is critical to understanding the particular horror of what heparin overdose does to a human being. The body bleeds internally and progressively. The blood that should move through vessels and carry oxygen to organs begins to escape into surrounding tissue, into body cavities, into spaces where it has no function and causes only harm. The victim experiences this as increasing pain, weakness, and confusion. For patients who were already critically ill, already in pain, already frightened and dependent on the people around them, this process was an additional and invisible cruelty layered on top of everything they were already enduring. The doctors treating the sudden deteriorations were not fools. They were experienced physicians doing their jobs correctly with the information available to them. When a patient in an intensive care unit develops a hemorrhagic crisis, the differential diagnosis is extensive. It can point to the underlying illness. It can point to a medication interaction. It can point to a previously undetected condition. Without reason to suspect deliberate tampering, the working assumption was always medical, always a clinical explanation within the known parameters of the patient's condition. Zelenka understood this. He had counted on it. He had, according to what emerged later in testimony and legal proceedings, calculated that the institutional context of the ICU would provide cover for what he was doing. The deaths would be mourned and processed within the framework of medical reality. Tragic, but not suspicious. And for an extended period spanning many weeks and mounting casualties, he was correct. But the universe of coincidence has limits. Somewhere around the 7th month of his campaign, the internal data of the hospital began telling a story that could not be easily dismissed. The number of patients experiencing abnormal coagulation episodes, unusual, unexplained bleeding events, was not statistically consistent with normal ICU outcomes. It was too high, too concentrated. The pattern was too specific. Medical administrators and physicians who began reviewing the data with growing unease noted that the incidents appeared to cluster around particular shifts. They noted that patients who had been relatively stable were experiencing crises that seemed disconnected from the logical progression of their diagnoses. The quiet alarm that had been building in the background of institutional awareness began to sharpen into something more pointed. The hospital began its own internal investigation. And as those investigators began pulling records, cross-referencing shift schedules, reviewing medication logs, and applying the uncomfortable lens of suspicion to the data in front of them, a name began to surface with uncomfortable frequency. Petr Zelenka had been present. Not once, not twice. Over and over again, in shift after shift during which patients had deteriorated without satisfactory medical explanation, the same name appeared in the staff rotation. He was there. He was always there. He was dismissed from his position at the end of September 2006, removed from the ward, stripped of his access to patients, while the investigation continued to build its case around him. But the arrest did not come immediately. It would take another full 3 months. 3 months during which the evidence was assembled, the forensic picture was constructed, and the legal threshold for charges was carefully met, before Petr Zelenka was taken into custody. In December 2006, he was arrested. When confronted with what investigators had discovered, he did not deny it. He confessed. He admitted to having administered the heparin. He admitted to the injections. And then he offered the explanation that would shock everyone who heard it. An explanation so staggering in its arrogance, so profoundly unhinged in its internal logic, that it made the already disturbing case something altogether darker. He said he had not meant to kill anyone. He said he had simply been testing the doctors. He believed they were incompetent. He wanted to see if they could figure out what he was doing. 7 people were dead. 10 more had survived near-lethal medical crises. And the man responsible sat in an interrogation room and described it as an experiment, a test, as though the 17 human beings he had targeted were not patients in his care but variables in a personal study, components in a twisted intellectual exercise designed to satisfy his own contempt for the colleagues he worked beside. There is a particular quality of grief that belongs to families who lose someone in a hospital. Families who carry the quiet assumption that everything possible was done, that the death, however crushing, was the result of forces beyond human control. They leave the hospital having signed paperwork, having spoken to doctors in hushed, compassionate tones, having received a cause of death that fit more or less within the medical reality of their loved one's condition. They go home. They arrange funerals. They sit in the paralysis of loss and begin the long, uneven work of carrying on. They do not know, cannot know, that the person they loved did not simply lose the fight against illness. They do not know that someone pressed a needle into their arm with deliberate intent. They do not know that the last moments of confusion and pain their family member endured were engineered by a man standing right beside them, holding a clipboard, nodding calmly at the attending physician, and saying nothing. For the families of the 7 confirmed murder victims of Petr Zelenka, that particular secondary devastation, the discovery that the death they had grieved as natural was, in fact, deliberately caused, came later. It came through news reports, through court proceedings, through the cold machinery of a criminal case that required their loved ones' deaths to be discussed as evidence. The grief they had already processed now carried a new and awful dimension. Betrayal. Pure, consuming betrayal at the hands of the medical system that should have protected those they trusted it with. The families of the 10 attempted murder survivors faced something different but no less scarring. Their loved ones had survived, had pulled back from the edge of a medical crisis that had appeared inexplicable, had recovered or partially recovered from hemorrhaging that the treating doctors had attributed to the illness. Some of those survivors may not have been fully aware of what had happened to them. Some may have been told, in general terms, that there had been a complication, a medication issue, without the full weight of what that meant being communicated in real time. When the full truth emerged, the survivors and their families had to integrate something deeply disturbing: the knowledge that they had come within a needle's length of being among the dead. That the same hands that had administered the injection that nearly killed them had also held the hands and monitored the vitals of 7 people who did not survive. That they were alive not because of anything they had done, not because their nurse had shown mercy, but because of physiology or timing or chance. The community of Havlikov Brod itself was shaken to its foundations. This was not a large metropolitan city where anonymity provides a buffer against communal trauma. This was a regional town with a population of approximately 25,000 people, the kind of place where the hospital is not an abstraction but a building that virtually every resident has passed through in some capacity, where the nurses who work there are not strangers but neighbors, acquaintances, people whose faces you recognize at the market or on the street. The revelation that one of those nurses, a man who had been promoted to lead the intensive care unit, a man entrusted with the most critically vulnerable patients in the building, had spent months deliberately poisoning those patients, sent a wave of collective horror through the community that did not quickly subside. How do you trust a hospital again after that? How do you place your elderly parent in an intensive care ward and not feel the cold dread of what had happened there? How do you sign the admission paperwork without thinking of the 7 people who signed it and did not come home? These were not abstract questions for the people of Havlikov Brod. They were immediate, daily, inescapable. The hospital responded, as institutions must, with procedural measures. Security cameras were installed throughout the premises. The process of drug administration was placed under stricter monitoring and oversight. Protocols around medication access were tightened. These were meaningful steps, appropriate responses to a catastrophic institutional failure. But protocols cannot fully address the deeper wound, the knowledge that the vulnerability had not been in the procedures but in the person. That what had made Zelenka dangerous was not a gap in a system but the specific, calculated coldness of one individual who had chosen to use his access for destruction. The psychological dimension of his stated motivation continued to occupy the minds of those trying to make sense of it. Court psychiatrists who examined Zelenka found him to be entirely sane. This was not a man operating in the grip of psychosis or hallucination. He was not hearing voices directing him to act. He was not detached from reality in any clinical sense. He was fully aware of what he was doing, fully in command of his own decisions, and fully cognizant of the consequences for his victims. Which meant the explanation he offered, the testing rationale, the contempt for his colleagues' competence, was not a symptom of mental illness but something arguably more troubling. A deliberate choice, rooted in arrogance, in a distorted sense of intellectual superiority, and in a catastrophic absence of empathy that allowed him to view living, suffering human beings as instruments of his own private assessment. His lawyer, in the period leading up to trial, characterized the killings as impulsive, acts driven by a compulsion rather than a formal plan. But the prosecutors saw it differently, and the evidence supported a different reading. The attacks had been repeated. They had been sustained across a period of months. They had required him to conceal a vial, approach victims strategically, and administer injections in a manner designed to avoid detection. This was not impulse. This was pattern. This was a man who had committed an act, observed the outcome, decided the outcome was acceptable, and committed the act again, and again, and again, 7 times resulting in death, 10 times resulting in survival that he may not have intended. The doctors whom he believed he was testing, the colleagues whose competence he had constructed an entire criminal campaign to measure, were never told they were participants in his experiment. They simply found themselves facing medical crises that defied easy explanation, working urgently to save patients who were deteriorating without obvious cause, doing everything in their power with the information available to them. Some of those patients were saved, some were not. And the man standing among them, watching, kept the vial in his pocket and waited for the next opportunity. When Petr Zelenka stood before the court in Hradec Králové in February of 2008, he did not enter a plea of innocence. He had already confessed. The facts were not in dispute. 7 dead, 10 nearly killed, 17 attacks across a 7-month period within the walls of a hospital where people went to get better. What the trial would determine was not whether he had done it, but the precise criminal weight of what he had done, and what the rest of his life would look like in consequence. The courtroom in Hradec Králové was the stage for a proceeding that had no real precedent in the Czech Republic's post-communist criminal history. The country had not produced a case like this before. An angel of death, as the criminal archetype of the healthcare worker who kills patients is historically classified, was not a figure that Czech jurisprudence had been required to formally process in this way within living memory. The proceedings were followed intensely by the national press. The public, still absorbing the shock of what had occurred in that Eastern Bohemian hospital, watched the trial with the kind of attention that a nation reserves for cases that have cut into its collective sense of safety. Because this case had not just ended 7 lives. It had done something more pervasive and harder to quantify. It had placed a question inside every hospital visit, every ICU admission, every act of vulnerable dependence on the medical system. It had asked, how would you know? How would any of us know? Zelenka entered the courtroom and bowed his head. He showed no emotion as Judge Yuri Vasek took his place. The defendant did not carry himself with the defiant energy of someone who believed they had done something righteous. He stood in the posture of a man who understood, at least on the surface, that the room's judgment was already formed and that the performance of contrition was all that remained available to him. He had, he claimed, not intended to kill anyone. He had been testing. He had been curious about the doctor's abilities. He had not expected people to die. This remained his position. It was not a position that moved the court. The psychiatric assessment had confirmed his sanity. The evidence had confirmed his actions. His own confession had confirmed the injections. Judge Vasic delivered the verdict: guilty of 7 murders and 10 attempted murders. Guilty on all 17 counts. The sentence was life imprisonment, the maximum available under Czech law, in the most secure category of detention. And then Judge Vasic did something remarkable. He went beyond the standard sentencing remarks and addressed, on the record, the question of what punishment would have been warranted had the legal framework permitted it. He stated clearly that, had the death penalty not been abolished in the Czech Republic in 1990, he would have imposed it. The judge was explicit. The nature of the crimes, the sustained nature of the attacks, the complete betrayal of professional duty, and the cold absence of remorse warranted the ultimate penalty. The law did not allow it, but the court's position was unmistakable. After the sentence was read, Zelenka stood and spoke briefly with his lawyer. And then, in the single moment of the entire proceeding that carried any visible human emotion, he wiped tears from his eyes. He had shown nothing during the verdict. He had absorbed the life sentence without visible reaction. But in the moment after, speaking quietly to the man who had defended him, something broke through. Whether those tears were grief for himself, guilt for what he had done, or simply the physical expression of the finality of a life sentence being delivered, no one could say with certainty. What they were not was enough. They were not enough for the families of 7 people who had gone into that hospital and been murdered by the man entrusted to care for them. They were not enough for the 10 individuals who had nearly died, who had survived hemorrhagic crises engineered by a colleague with a hidden vial and a warped intellectual agenda. They were not enough for a town that would carry this association forward into its history, its sense of itself, its relationship with the building at its center that had been both hospital and crime scene simultaneously. The conviction of Petr Zelenka formally made him the most prolific serial killer in the Czech Republic's post-communist era, a designation that sits in the historical record with a kind of bleak distinction. It was not a record anyone wanted to hold. It was not a verdict that resolved anything beyond the immediate legal question. The deeper questions that the case had opened, questions about oversight, about institutional vulnerability, about the particular danger posed by healthcare workers who use their access as a weapon, remained open, uncomfortable, and without simple answers. The hospital in Havlíčkův Brod restructured its protocols. But the restructuring happened after 7 people were already dead. The cameras went in after the ward had already been a crime scene for 7 months. The additional medication oversight came after 17 patients had been injected without consent, without medical justification, without any purpose that served their health or their survival. The safety measures, however necessary and however meaningful, could only address what might happen next. They could not reach back into those months of 2006 and undo what had occurred. They could not restore to the families what had been taken. They could not remove from the 10 survivors the knowledge of what had been done to them. And they could not answer the question that quietly haunted everyone who examined this case closely. What was Petr Zelenka actually thinking, in the full privacy of his own mind, when he stood in that ward with the vial in his pocket? His stated reason, the test, is the only account that exists. His lawyer presented it. He himself referenced it. And the legal proceedings accepted it as his stated motivation without endorsing it as a satisfying explanation. Because it is not satisfying. The testing rationale has an internal logic that collapses under scrutiny. A person who genuinely wanted to assess the diagnostic competence of colleagues does not need to kill 7 people to do it. A person who believed his colleagues were failing patients does not address that belief through a campaign of secret poisoning. A person acting out of professional frustration or misguided concern does not carry a concealed vial through shift after shift for 7 months, administering it in the quiet of the night ward, and then continue doing so after the first death, the second, the third. What Zelenka described as a test was, in reality, something that serves no coherent external purpose. It served him. It satisfied something in him. It gave him access to something. Control, power, the sensation of holding life and death in the same hands that tucked in blankets and checked 4 lines. That he found, on some level, compelling enough to repeat 17 times. That is the honest shape of this case. Not a man driven by mercy, as some healthcare killers claim to be. Not a man acting on delusion, as the psychiatrists confirmed he was not. A man who made a choice, repeated it, watched people die and nearly die as a consequence, and continued making it. For 7 months, across 17 patients, in a building full of colleagues and cameras and documentation and families, until the pattern became impossible to ignore and the institution was finally forced to see what had been happening inside it. Petr Zelenka remains in a maximum security Czech prison, serving a life sentence. He is, as of the current date, 49 years old. He has been imprisoned for over 17 years. The judge who sentenced him has gone on record as believing that life imprisonment was the minimum adequate response to what was done. The Czech Republic has had no comparable case since. The hospital in Havlíčkův Brod continues to operate, serving its community, treating its patients, staffed by nurses and doctors who arrive each day and perform work that is genuinely, uncomplicated, wholly oriented toward the preservation of human life. The dark chapter from 2006 is not forgotten. It lives in the institutional memory, in the tightened protocols, in the cameras that now watch the corridors where Zelenka once moved freely, and in the town itself, in the people who remember the names on the news reports, the faces of the families outside the courthouse, the verdict delivered in Hradec Králové and the tears that followed it. And it lives in the enduring, unsettling knowledge that the most dangerous person in a hospital is not always the one wheeled through the doors on a gurney. Sometimes it is the one who holds the door open. Sometimes it is the one who carries the medicine. Sometimes it is the one who knows every patient's name, every patient's condition, and the precise dosage at which a drug that saves lives becomes the thing that ends them. Petr Zelenka, the heparin killer, the angel of death in Ward 4. The nurse who played God with 17 lives in a quiet Czech hospital, and who now sits in a maximum security cell, a life sentence pressing down on every day that remains of his own. 7 families buried someone because of him. 10 people survived something they were never meant to survive. And a town, a hospital, a nation, still carry the weight of what one man with a hidden vial decided to do with the access, the trust, and the uniform that had been given to him. If you're enjoying these stories, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. I'd love to hear from you. And if you haven't already, like this video and subscribe so you never miss an upload. Now let's get into our third and final story. Story 3. The Devil in Uniform. Igor Shernat, aka the evil spirit of Kokjarvi / the Kamensky maniac. The Soviet soldier who turned the forest into his killing ground. He wore the uniform of a protector. He was anything but. Picture this, a military base deep in the Soviet wilderness, 1985. Women travel hundreds of miles to visit their sons and husbands, trusting the walls, the gates, the authority of the uniform standing at the checkpoint. They arrive with food parcels, with love, with open hearts. And somewhere inside those grounds, a young soldier is watching them arrive. Not with duty, not with discipline, with hunger, the kind no commanding officer could ever train out of a man. His name was Igor Shernat. He was barely 20 years old. And by the time anyone realized what was living inside those barracks, the forest around the base of Kamenka had already swallowed women whole. Their screams absorbed by the pines, their bodies claimed by the earth, their belongings sold at an open-air market as casually as one might sell old boots. This is not the story of a monster born in darkness. This is the story of one built in plain sight, trained, armed, and given access. This is the story of how the Soviet army unknowingly handed a predator a uniform, a forest, and an endless supply of trusting victims. And this is the story of how, when it was all over, the predator walked into a police station and confessed with the cold indifference of a man who had simply grown tired of running. There is a city on the Black Sea coast where the summers are golden and the streets carry the smell of salt and old stone. Odessa, in what was then the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, was a port city of culture, of sailors, of industry, of ambition. It was also the city where Igor Shernat was born, somewhere around 1966. The exact date lost to the kind of bureaucratic indifference that the Soviet system applied to ordinary citizens who had not yet done anything worth documenting. He grew up on Pionierskoye Street, a name that carried the weight of Soviet idealism. The Pioneers were the youth organization designed to mold young Soviet citizens into disciplined, loyal, productive members of the state. The irony would not become clear until decades later, when the boy who grew up on that street was sentenced to death for crimes so savage that they shocked even investigators hardened by years of Soviet-era brutality. His early life holds almost no distinguishable markers. He studied at Velikodolinskaya Secondary School No. 1 in the Odessa Oblast, completing his education through the 8th grade before transitioning to a vocational school. Nothing about his academic record, his childhood behavior, or his relationships with peers and family members was preserved in any publicly accessible record. History has given us almost nothing of the boy, only the monster he became. What we do know is that after vocational school, Chernat studied as a driver through the DOSOF, the Voluntary Society for Assistance to the Army, Aviation, and Navy. This was a paramilitary organization common throughout Soviet society that provided citizens with technical and military training. Learning to drive armored vehicles, understanding military discipline, becoming familiar with the rigid hierarchy of Soviet armed forces. These were the building blocks of the path he was put on. Then, in 1985, the Soviet state did what it did with young men of his age. It drafted him. Igor Chernat was conscripted into the Soviet army and assigned as an infantry fighting vehicle driver. His assignment placed him at the village of Kamenka, situated in the Vyborgsky district of the Leningrad Oblast, where he would serve as part of the 138th Guards Motor Rifle Brigade. It was a posting far from the bustling port city of his childhood. Kamenka was surrounded by deep, ancient forest, the kind of wilderness that the Soviet state had carved military installations into like hidden teeth in a vast green jaw. The nearest major city of note was Vyborg, a place where markets operated and where a soldier could sell things without attracting much attention. For most conscripts, military service was a brutal but finite experience. The Soviet military was infamous for its culture of Dedovshchina, a deeply entrenched system of hazing and abuse by older soldiers against newer recruits, a tradition of violence carried out within the ranks that commanders often ignored or actively enabled. Young men arrived at their postings expecting hardship. What they did not expect, could never have expected, was that one of the soldiers standing alongside them in formation had already decided that the forest beyond the fence was his private hunting ground. Understanding what happened inside Igor Chernat's mind during those early months of service is impossible. There are no psychiatric evaluations available to the public, no childhood trauma records, no documented history of violence before his military posting. What the record gives us instead is a timeline of crimes, a sequence of acts committed against women who had done nothing more dangerous than love the men assigned to that base. The women who came to Kamenka came in trust. That is the detail that must not be passed over lightly, because it is the detail that makes what Chernat did so particularly vile. These were not strangers in the wrong place at the wrong time in some abstract urban sense. They were women with specific personal reasons for being at that gate. They were mothers bringing food to sons who were not allowed to leave. They were wives crossing vast distances to spend a few hours with husbands locked behind military walls. They arrived at the checkpoint, they showed their documents, they were allowed inside, or they were stopped at the gate and met by a soldier who offered to help, to guide, to escort. That soldier was Chernat. It was November 1985 when he committed his first murder. The details of this initial killing were not known to investigators until after his arrest, because the crime was not yet connected to a broader pattern. Chernat disclosed it only during interrogation, retroactively adding it to the case file. What we know is that his first victim was a woman who came to the base, one of those trusting souls who arrived at the fence believing she was safe because soldiers were supposed to be guardians. Chernat led her away from the eyes of others, into the tree line, into the darkness between the pines where the forest floor was soft and the sound of the bass disappeared quickly. What he did there, he did without hesitation. He returned to formation. He ate in the mess hall. He slept in his bunk. And the forest kept its silence. The weeks turned. The months passed. Other soldiers rotated duties, sent letters home, complained about the food and the cold. Shernat moved through all of it with the practiced stillness of a person carrying a secret so enormous it had reshaped his entire internal landscape. He was a soldier. He was a driver. He was unremarkable. And the forest outside the perimeter of the base held the only evidence of what he truly was. It is worth pausing here to consider the environment in which Shernat operated. Kamenka was not a base known for its exemplary discipline. The investigation that eventually followed the discovery of his crimes would peel back the surface of military life there and expose a culture that had been rotting for years. Desertion, theft, the brutal hazing of Didovshchina, young men beaten and humiliated by older ones in a cycle of institutionalized cruelty that the command structure either could not or would not break. Corruption moved through the ranks like groundwater, invisible but constant. In this environment, a certain kind of predator could thrive. The chaos of a poorly supervised, corruption-riddled military posting created gaps. Gaps in accountability, gaps in observation, gaps in the kind of institutional vigilance that might have caught Shernat before his body count climbed. When the hierarchy is focused on covering its own misconduct, it has no eyes left for the soldier who slips away from the checkpoint with a female visitor and doesn't come back for 2 hours. Shernat understood this environment instinctively, or perhaps discovered its contours through trial and error. Either way, he used it. The base's dysfunction was his cover, the forest was his stage, and the trusting women at the gate were, to his mind, a resource. What drove him? The records do not say. The psychological architecture of his violence, whether it was rooted in sexual compulsion, in rage, in a desire for power over the powerless, was never fully examined in any document available to the public. What we have instead are his actions, and his actions speak with a volume that psychological theory rarely matches. By the time winter released its grip on the Leningrad Oblast and 1985 became 1986, Igor Shernat had killed once. He had not been questioned. He had not been seen. The first victim's fate had not yet drawn investigators to the base. Or if it had, the connection to Shernat had not yet been made. The forest had kept its secret, and Shernat was already choosing his next target. The geography of Kamenka and its surrounding woodland deserves attention. Lake Kokjarvi lies in this region, a body of water whose name would eventually become part of Chernat's grotesque legacy. The forests around Kamenka were thick and largely uninhabited, crisscrossed by old paths and military tracks but otherwise unpopulated by civilians. The lake, the trees, the frozen ground in winter and the soft earth in the warmer months. This landscape offered a predator something invaluable: concealment. Soviet investigators who would later work this case understood the geography. They understood that a soldier with access to the grounds beyond the base perimeter, familiar with the tree lines, the paths, the hiding places, such a soldier had a profound tactical advantage over any woman he decided to follow into those woods. The forest that should have been beautiful was, for the women of Kamenka's visiting families, the most dangerous place within 100 miles. What made Shernat particularly difficult to detect in these early months was his method of selection. He did not choose women at random from the surrounding civilian population, which might have drawn regional law enforcement attention more quickly. He chose women who were connected to the base, visitors, family members of serving soldiers. This meant that when a woman went missing after visiting Kamenka, the initial inquiries circled around the base but faced the wall of military jurisdiction, military records, and a chain of command with every reason to suppress scandal rather than surface it. By early 1986, Igor Shernat was a killer who had murdered once and gotten away with it entirely. He was 20 years old. He was in uniform. He was trusted. And the impulse that had driven him into the forest that first time in November 1985 had not diminished. If anything, survival had fed it. The second hunt was already being planned. The Soviet Union of 1985 and 1986 was a state in turbulent transition. Mikhail Gorbachev had come to power in March 1985, bringing with him the early winds of glasnost and perestroika, concepts of openness and restructuring that would eventually crack the Soviet system wide open. But in 1986, on a remote military base in the Leningrad Oblast, none of that political upheaval reached down to the level of a conscript soldier and the women who trusted him. The Cold War still cast its long shadow. the military still operated as a closed institution. And within that institution, a predator moved freely. The forests around Kamenka were ancient. They had seen empires rise and fall, had absorbed the sounds of Finnish wars and German advances and Soviet reconquests. They were not forests that surrendered their secrets easily, and Shernat, whether through instinct or calculation, had chosen his killing ground well. Deep enough into the tree line that no sound carried back to the gates. Dense enough that a body could lie undiscovered for days or weeks or longer, depending on the season. The first murder had given him something dangerous: confidence. The knowledge that he could walk back through those trees, resume his duties, eat his rations, and face no consequences. That knowledge was, in its own terrible way, a transformation. Whatever Igor Shernat had been before November 1985, whatever ordinary, unremarkable young man had existed on Pioneerskoye Street in Odessa, that person was gone. In his place stood something that wore the uniform and performed the routines, but underneath the fabric was a different creature entirely. And in the spring of 1986, that creature emerged again. March 1986. The snow in the Leningrad Oblast was beginning to thin in places, the frost loosening its grip on the earth in the afternoons, though the mornings still arrived with bone-deep cold. It was in this seasonal half-light between winter and spring that Igor Shernat chose his second victim. Her name was Yevgenia Nazarova. She had traveled to Kamenka for the most ordinary and loving of reasons. Her husband was a soldier stationed there, and he was in the base's medical unit, ill in the infirmary. She wanted to see him. She may have brought food or medicine, or simply herself, the comfort of her presence for a young man enduring the misery of sickness far from home. She arrived at the base checkpoint, announced herself, and waited, and Shernat appeared. The mechanics of how he separated her from the checkpoint, how he offered himself as an escort or presented himself as an authorized guide to the medical facility, are not detailed in available records. What is known is that he led her away from the checkpoint's sightlines. He took her somewhere with no witnesses, and then, in the forest or at its edge, he raped her and murdered her, using a fishing line to take her life. The choice of method is significant. A fishing line is not a weapon of impulse, not something grabbed in a moment of rage. It is a deliberate instrument, thin and strong, capable of inflicting an agonizingly slow death. The use of such a method on Yevgenia Nazarova suggests premeditation, that by the time Shernat acted against her, the decision had already been made. She was not the random target of a sudden violent impulse. She was a chosen victim, lured, followed, and killed with a specific tool. After her death, he robbed her of her belongings. This detail, the robbery of his victims, adds a dimension to Chernat's psychology that distinguishes him from killers driven purely by sexual compulsion or rage. He was also practical. He was also mercenary. The women he killed became, in his mind, a source of resources as well as an outlet for violence. He took what they carried and sold it at the market in Viborg. He converted their murder into cash with the same casual efficiency that another soldier might use to sell black market cigarettes. The market in Viborg, some distance from Kamenka, gave him enough separation from the base to reduce the risk of recognition. He sold stolen goods. He pocketed the money. He returned to his duties. Yevgenia Nazarova's death did not immediately trigger an investigation focused on Shernat. The military's internal machinery did what it so often did. It absorbed the incident, attempted to manage it within the walls of military jurisdiction, and moved slowly. The investigation that followed was not swift, not aggressive, not conducted with the urgency that the murder of a civilian woman in proximity to a military base should have demanded. Mid-April 1986, the third murder. This time, the victim was Victoria Bykovskaya. She was not a wife. She was a mother, a woman who had traveled to the base carrying food for her son, one of the conscripts stationed at Kamenka. There is something particularly devastating about this detail, something that resists easy articulation. She came because she was worried. She came because the food in the military was not enough, or because she wanted her son to have something from home. Something that smelled like the kitchen, like her hands, like the world he had left behind when he was drafted. She came because mothers do what mothers do. and at the gate of the 138th Guards Motor Rifle Brigade, she encountered the worst thing that had ever worn a Soviet uniform. Shernat intercepted her, led her away, and killed her. He robbed her too. Her belongings, whatever she had brought, whatever she carried, went to Viborg, to the open market, to be sold for whatever they would fetch. 3 murders, 3 women, all of them connected to the base, all of them robbed, all of them killed in or near the forest surrounding Kamenka. The weeks between each killing are telling. Shernat did not kill in a frenzy. He was not escalating rapidly in the way that some serial offenders do, compressing the intervals between crimes as compulsion overcomes restraint. He waited. He watched. He selected. This suggests a level of patience and self-regulation that made him particularly difficult to catch through behavioral profiling alone. He was not a man losing control of himself. He was a man in control of a process that he had decided was worth repeating. The 4th murder followed soon after the 3rd. The victim was Elena Ivanova, the wife of another soldier stationed at the base. She arrived as wives arrived, with her documents, with her hope for a few hours with her husband, with the absolute trust that the uniformed men at the gate represented safety and institutional protection. She did not survive the meeting with Shernat, but this time something changed. A private named Zevelyuk was in the right place, or from Chernat's perspective, the catastrophically wrong place, to observe what he would later describe to investigators. He had seen Elena Ivanova on the day of her disappearance in the company of a soldier walking toward the forest. He noted the direction. He noted the soldier. He could not have known in that moment that he was witnessing the last living minutes of a woman's life, but he registered the detail, stored it, and when the investigation began in earnest, he produced it. Private Zevelyuk's testimony would become the thread that began to unravel everything. In the aftermath of the 4th murder, large-scale inspections were launched across all military units stationed at Kamenka. These inspections were not, initially, purely about the murders. They were triggered by the broader dysfunction that investigators and military officials could no longer ignore. What the inspections revealed was a base in deep institutional crisis. Desertion, systematic theft of military property, rampant dedovshchina, the hazing system by which older soldiers terrorized newer ones in cycles of physical and psychological abuse. The picture that emerged was of a military posting that had been permitted to rot from within, where discipline was a performance put on for visiting officials and abandoned the moment the gates closed. In this environment, the inspectors began to pull at threads. One of the soldiers under scrutiny for theft of military property, feeling the pressure of investigation bearing down, made a remark that would prove consequential. He told investigators that Shernat had stolen the most, and that nothing would happen to him. The implication was clear. Shernat had some protection, some arrangement, some leverage. The comment drew the inspector's attention directly to him. When Shernat was brought in for interrogation regarding the theft allegations, the questioning began with military property and ended somewhere far more serious. But Shernat did not break during that first session. Instead, he did something that shocked his interrogators and would continue to define the narrative of this case for decades. He fled. That same night, after his interrogation, Igor Shernat escaped. He deserted his post, abandoned the base, and made his way back toward Odessa, back toward the city of his childhood, the streets he had grown up on, the place that was the only geography he had ever truly known. What was he thinking during that journey south? Did he believe he could disappear into civilian life? Did he think that the isolation of Kamenka, the slowness of Soviet military bureaucracy, the general chaos of a corrupt and poorly managed base would be enough to bury his crimes permanently? Or did some part of him already know that there was no version of the future in which he was not caught? In Odessa, he attempted to obtain new documents, forged identity papers that might allow him to assume a new identity and vanish into Soviet civilian life. This was a world before digital records, before the kind of interlocking databases that would make such an escape impossible today. In theory, with the right documents and enough distance from the scene of his crimes, a man could become someone else. Shernat tried, and failed. The attempt to forge or obtain fraudulent documents collapsed, its mechanics lost to the historical record, but its outcome clear. He could not make it work. And then he did something that has puzzled criminologists and historians who have studied his case ever since. Something that cuts against the instinct for self-preservation. Something that suggests, in its own terrible and ambiguous way, that the weight of what he had done had become, on some level, too much to carry alone in the ordinary streets of Odessa. Igor Chernat walked into a police station. He announced himself as the maniac responsible for the murders at Kamenka. He surrendered. He confessed. He was 20 years old. The confession was voluntary, uninstructed, uncoerced. He had not been cornered by investigators closing in, had not been caught in the act, had not been trapped by forensic evidence. He had fled, failed to reinvent himself, and then, of his own volition, placed himself back into the hands of the system. Soviet authorities transported him to Leningrad, where the formal interrogation and investigation began. Chernat was processed through the military justice system, his confession examined, his testimony recorded, the details of each murder extracted and verified. It was during this period that the first murder, the one from November 1985, the killing he had never reported and that investigators had not yet connected to him, was added to the case file. Chernat disclosed it himself. The confirmed victim count stood at 4, but investigators suspected more. The possible range of victims was placed at 4 to 13, a gap that reflects the difficulty of establishing a complete picture when the perpetrator is a soldier operating within a closed military environment, when bodies may not have been discovered, when some victims may never have been reported missing in the context of connection to Kamenka. 13. The upper limit of what investigators believed was possible. Think about that number. Think about what it means in practical terms. Up to 13 women arriving at a gate in good faith, trusting the uniform, trusting the checkpoint, trusting the institution, and meeting a soldier who was already deciding whether they were a suitable target. To understand the full weight of what Igor Chernat did, it is necessary to slow down and examine not just the sequence of events but the nature of the crimes themselves. The deliberateness of the violence, the predatory architecture of each killing, and the specific vulnerability of the women he chose. Every single confirmed victim of Igor Chernat shared one fundamental characteristic. She had come to Kamenka because of love. Not romantic love in some abstract sense, but the urgent, practical love that makes a mother pack food into a bag and travel for hours, or that makes a wife calculate the distance to a military base and decide the journey is worth it just to see a familiar face behind the wire. These were women defined, at the moment of their deaths, by devotion to someone else. They had come not for themselves but for others. And Chernat positioned himself precisely at the point where that devotion became vulnerability. The checkpoint, the gate, the moment of arrival. The first murder, November 1985, remains the least documented of the confirmed killings. Chernat revealed it only under interrogation, and the details that emerged, if any additional details emerged beyond the basic fact of the killing, were not preserved in records accessible to later researchers. What is known is that the first murder established the template. A woman at or near the base, separation from the checkpoint, the forest, death, the theft of her belongings. That template was not accidental. It was refined. By the time of the second murder, in March 1986, Chernat had 4 months of unchallenged impunity behind him. For months during which no investigator had knocked on his door, no commanding officer had called him in for questioning, no fellow soldier had pointed a finger. For months that told him conclusively that the system was not watching him, or if it was not watching closely enough to see what he actually was. Yevgenia Nazarova arrived to see her sick husband, who was confined to the base's medical facility. The medical unit was separated from the checkpoint. There was physical distance to cross, ground to cover, and that journey required guidance or at least direction. Chernat provided both. He led her away from the checkpoint's visual field, away from any position where another pair of eyes might register her trajectory, and into the place where he had decided she would die. The fishing line is worth returning to because it is one of the most clinically chilling details in the entire case. A fishing line is designed to restrain, to resist breaking under tension, to dig in. As a murder weapon applied to a human throat, it produces an extraordinarily slow and painful death. Cuts into skin. It resists the victim's attempt to pull it away. The killer must maintain sustained, deliberate pressure over a period of time that feels, to the victim, like an eternity. There is no quickening the process. It is intimate in the worst possible way, face-to-face, hands involved, the killer forced to remain present through the entirety of what he is doing. The choice of this method tells us that Chernat did not look away from what he was doing to Yevgenia Nazarova. He was there, fully present, through the duration. Whatever was happening inside him during those minutes. Whether it was cold detachment or something darker, more engaged, he did not stop. He did not flinch. He completed it. Then he took her things, returned to the base, and continued his life. Victoria Bykovskaya was a mother. This distinction matters not because mothers are more valuable than wives, or because the grief of a son losing a mother is worse than the grief of a husband losing a wife. All grief in this story is enormous and real, but because it speaks to the particular callousness of what Chernat chose to do. He killed a woman who had come to the base carrying food for her child. In one of the most elemental acts of parental love, she had made a journey to feed her son. He was not allowed to leave, so she came to him. She had the food in her hands, or in a bag on her shoulder, at the moment she encountered Chernat. What happened to Victoria Bykovskaya in the forest follows the same terrible architecture as what had happened to the woman before her. She was taken from the proximity of the checkpoint and led into the trees. The forest received her, and when Chernat returned to the base, he carried her belongings with him. Goods he would later convert to cash at the Vyborg market. The market detail deserves extended attention because it illuminates a dimension of Chernat's psychology that goes beyond the mechanics of predatory violence. He was not simply a killer who stole out of opportunistic impulse. He was a killer who maintained an ongoing economic relationship with his crimes. The Vyborg market was not directly connected to Kamenka in any way that would make a transaction suspicious. It was distant enough, busy enough, anonymous enough to provide cover. A soldier arriving with goods to sell was not an unusual sight. No one at the market was asking where the items came from, and Chernat sold them with the practiced ease of a man who had decided that murder had, among its other functions, a financial benefit. This practicality, this converting of atrocity into income, marks Chernat as something more calculated than the image of the impulsive, rage-driven killer that popular culture tends to favor. He was organized. He thought ahead. He managed risk across multiple transactions: the murder, the theft, the storage of stolen items, the journey to Vyborg, the sale, the return. Each step was a decision. Each decision was made correctly enough, from his perspective, that the cycle continued without interruption across 4 confirmed murders and, investigators believed, potentially many more. Elena Ivanova was the 4th confirmed victim, and her case introduced the element that would ultimately bring Chernat down. Private Zevelyuk's observation, seeing her walk toward the forest with a soldier, was the first crack in the wall of silence and invisibility behind which Chernat had operated for nearly a year. What Zevelyuk saw was probably unremarkable in isolation. A soldier and a female visitor walking together in the direction of the trees was not, on the surface, an alarming sight. It could have been a husband and wife seeking a few minutes of privacy. It could have been a son walking his mother toward a quieter spot. The Soviet military base was not a place of great personal freedom, and people created small pockets of privacy wherever they could. So Zevelyuk noticed, but perhaps did not think much of it at the time. It was only when Elena Ivanova did not return, when the base eventually became aware of another disappearance, another woman connected to a serving soldier gone without explanation, that Zevelyuk's memory of what he had seen became something actionable. He could describe the soldier. He had a direction of travel. He had a time. It was not conclusive, but it was a vector, and in an investigation that had previously been operating without any directional information at all, a vector was everything. The inspections that followed the 4th murder were broad and brutal in their thoroughness. They exposed the rotten core of Kamenka's military culture. The thefts, the hazing, the desertions, the corruption that had been building for years beneath the surface of institutional discipline. And in the course of those inspections, as soldiers were interrogated about the theft of military property, the name Igor Chernat came up in a way that put him at the center of the investigative gaze. He was brought in. He was questioned. The interrogation, it seems, was approaching some point at which the accumulation of circumstantial evidence and witness accounts might have forced a confession or an admission. But Shernat did not stay long enough to reach that point. He escaped in the night. The act of flight was, in its own way, the most dramatic confirmation of guilt that the investigation could have received. An innocent man, questioned about military property theft, does not typically vanish from a military base in the darkness of night. He argues, he protests, he demands documentation. Shernat ran, and his running told investigators everything, even if it also temporarily removed him from their reach. Consider the logistics of his flight. He was a young soldier in a country where internal movement was monitored, where identification documents were required for travel, where the state apparatus, even in its mid-1980s state of creeping dysfunction, maintained a degree of surveillance over ordinary citizens that would seem extraordinary by later democratic standards. Reaching Odessa from the Leningrad Oblast required crossing significant geographic and bureaucratic distance. He made it, which means he had some resources, some plan, some contacts or capability for movement that had not previously drawn attention. But in Odessa, the plan fell apart. The attempt to create false documents, to sever his identity from his crimes and become an unreachable ghost in Soviet civilian life, failed. And in that failure, something happened to Igor Shernat that we cannot fully understand from the outside, but that we can observe in its outcome. He decided to stop running. The walk to the police station, the announcement of his identity, the statement that he was the maniac they were looking for. These acts are not the behavior of a man broken by a collapsing plan, operating under the pressure of imminent capture. They read more like a decision, a choice. A man who had killed up to 4 women, possibly up to 13, choosing at the age of 20 to close the account. Why? The records do not say. The psychology is not preserved. What we have is the act itself, stripped of its interior logic, standing as one of the most peculiar and unsettling details in a case already full of unsettling details. He wanted to be known for what he had done, or he was exhausted by the weight of it, or the alternative, a life lived in hiding under a false name, always one document check away from discovery, was worse than whatever came next. Or perhaps, after a year of killing and escaping consequence, the fact that the world did not yet know was more unbearable than the certainty of punishment. Whatever drove him to that police station, the act set in motion the final chapter. He was transported to Leningrad. The formal legal machinery of the Soviet military justice system took hold, and the investigation that had been chasing a ghost for the better part of a year finally had the ghost sitting across a table, talking. The interrogation rooms of Leningrad in 1986 were not places of comfort or warmth. The Soviet Union's legal and investigative apparatus was not designed with the rights of the accused as its primary concern. Interrogations were long, methodical, and operated within a system that granted investigators considerable latitude in how they managed the process of extracting truth from the people seated before them. For a man like Igor Shernat, who had arrived voluntarily and announced his own guilt, the interrogation was perhaps less a confrontation than a documentary process, the gradual, systematic extraction of details that would build the legal record needed for prosecution. Shernat spoke. He described the first murder, the November 1985 killing that had not yet been attributed to him, that investigators did not even know to ask about. He added it to the record himself. He described the second murder, the third, the fourth. He described where he had taken the women, what he had done, what method he had used, where the bodies could be found. The fishing line used on Yevgenia Nazarova. The forest beyond the checkpoint. The belongings carried back to base and then transported to the market in Vyborg. The transactions. The money. The return to duty as though nothing had happened. Investigators listened, recorded, verified. What emerged from the interrogation process was not merely a confession but a portrait of a predatory system at work. A system that had operated within the physical and institutional framework of a Soviet military base, exploiting the trust that women placed in that institution and the gaps created by that institution's profound dysfunction. The suspected victim count of 4 to 13 haunted the investigation. 4 murders had been confirmed. But the upper estimate of 13 reflected a genuine investigative concern that the confirmed cases were not the complete picture. The secrecy surrounding military bases, the likelihood that some disappearances had been absorbed into the chaos of the base's broader dysfunction without being properly investigated, the possibility that some victims had never been formally reported missing. All of these factors meant that the true scale of Chernat's crimes might never be fully known. Soviet-era record-keeping for cases involving military personnel was complicated by jurisdictional overlaps between civilian law enforcement and military legal structures. Cases that began on military property fell under the authority of military tribunals, and military tribunals operated with a degree of institutional opacity that served the Soviet state's interest in managing its own image. Scandals on military bases, murders, rapes, desertions, corruption, were not generally the subjects of open reporting in the Soviet press. Glasnost was in its earliest and most tentative stages in 1986. The machinery of Soviet information control was still largely intact. This meant that the investigation into Igor Chernat's crimes was conducted largely without public awareness. The women of the Leningrad Oblast who lived near military installations did not receive public warnings about a predator operating at Kamenka. The families of women who had visited that base and returned safely did not know how close they might have come to becoming statistics in a case that was being processed quietly within the walls of military justice. The Soviet state's reflex toward information suppression served, in this case, to protect Chernat's legacy from the kind of public scrutiny that might have produced a more complete accounting of his crimes. During the interrogation process in Leningrad, Chernat testified. The exact content of everything he said, every detail, every disclosure, was processed within the military legal system and has not been fully surfaced in publicly available documents. What is known is that his testimony was extensive enough to form the basis of a legal proceeding and that it confirmed the essential facts: the murders, the methods, the locations, the thefts, the market sales. The military tribunal of the Leningrad Military District was the body that would adjudicate his fate. Unlike civilian courts, military tribunals in the Soviet Union operated within a chain of command that connected directly to the military's institutional hierarchy. The judges were military officers. The proceedings followed military legal procedure, and the sentence available for crimes of the nature and scale that Chernat had committed was the one that the Soviet legal code reserved for the most extreme cases: death. The tribunal sentenced Igor Chernat to the exceptional measure of punishment, capital punishment, to be carried out by firing squad. There was no lengthy appeals process in the Western democratic sense. There was no extended period of years on death row. The Soviet system moved differently. Once the sentence was confirmed through the appropriate legal channels and review process, it was carried out. In October 1987, in Leningrad, the sentence was executed. Igor Chernat was approximately 20 to 21 years old. The boy from Odessa, the driver trained by the Dosov, the conscript assigned to the 138th Guards Motor Rifle Brigade, the soldier who had used the trust of visiting women as a weapon against them, he was dead, shot by a firing squad on Soviet soil, before he had reached an age when most people are still figuring out who they are and what they want from life. The names that survive this case deserve their own moment of recognition, because in a story dominated by the machinery of crime, investigation, confession, and punishment, the victims can be reduced to details in a timeline. They were not details. Yevgenia Nazarova was a wife who traveled to see her sick husband. She had done nothing wrong, made no bad decision, exercised no poor judgment. She went to a base, she met a soldier at a checkpoint, and she was killed with a fishing line in a Soviet forest because a predator in uniform decided she was prey. Victoria Bykovskaya was a mother who packed food for her son because she was his mother and he was far from home. She wanted him to eat well, to know she was thinking of him. She arrived at the base and she did not leave it alive. Elena Ivanova was a wife. She came, as wives come, to maintain the human connection across the distance that military service imposed. She walked toward the forest with a soldier whom Private Zeveliuk watched, and she never came back. The first victim, the woman killed in November 1985, whose details are the least preserved of the confirmed cases, was also someone's daughter, someone's friend, someone's reason for existing. Her name, if it was ever formally recorded in connection with this case, has not survived in the publicly available record. She is known only by the month and year of her death and by the fact that Shernat told investigators about her himself. Up to 9 more, possibly, lie in the gap between 4 and 13. The forests around Lake Cockjarvey have kept their secrets for 40 years. The name the monster earned, the evil spirit of Cockjarvey, carries the weight of that geography. Not the evil spirit of a face or a name or a street, but of a body of water surrounded by trees in the Leningrad Oblast, a place of natural quiet that became, in the mid-1980s, the killing ground of a Soviet conscript who should never have been given the access, the trust, or the opportunity that the 138th Guards Motor Rifle Brigade unknowingly provided him. His other name, the Kamensky Maniac, ties him to the village, to the base, to the institution that housed him, armed him, trained him, and failed completely to detect what he was doing in the spaces between his official duties. What does it mean that he confessed? That he walked into a police station in Odessa and announced himself? Some criminologists who have studied Soviet-era serial killers have noted that voluntary confession, in that particular social and political environment, sometimes reflected a calculation rather than remorse. The understanding that discovery was inevitable and that appearing cooperative might, in theory, influence the outcome. In Chernat's case, if that was the calculation, it failed. The tribunal sentenced him to death regardless. Others have suggested that voluntary confession in young killers can reflect something more psychologically complex. The desire for recognition, the need to be seen as the author of something enormous, the compulsion to claim credit for crimes that the world does not yet know to attribute to you. This interpretation is speculative, but it fits the circumstances. Shernat was not trapped. He was not cornered. He walked in and said, "This is what I am. This is what I did." For the families of the confirmed victims, the confession and the conviction were, in the only way that matters to people whose loved ones have been taken, a form of closure. The man who led their wives and mothers and daughters into the forest was identified, prosecuted, and executed. The Soviet state, slow and opaque as it was in its handling of the case, ultimately delivered a verdict that the facts demanded. But for the families of the possible additional victims, the women who might fill the space between 4 and 13, there was no such closure. Their losses may never have been formally connected to this case. Their grief may have unfolded in ignorance of why the women they loved disappeared, or with only the cold comfort of speculation. The Soviet state's information management meant that even the existence of a killer at Kamenka was not public knowledge during the period when additional families might have come forward to provide information. The Leningrad Oblast in 1987 moved on. The military base continued to operate. The forest around Lake Cockjarvey remained dense and quiet. Gorbachev's reforms were gathering momentum, and within a few years, the Soviet Union itself would begin its long dissolution. The world that had created Igor Shernat, the compulsory military service, the closed bases, the culture of Dedovshchina, the institutional opacity, was already beginning to fracture. Chernat's case was not extensively documented in the Soviet press. The state's instinct for controlling narratives that reflected badly on its military was not overcome by glasnost quickly enough for this case to receive the kind of coverage that might have ensured its preservation in historical memory. What survived is fragmentary, the Wikipedia entry, the criminological databases, the brief records of a military tribunal's verdict. But the essential facts are not in dispute. They were established through Chernat's own testimony, through the investigative process that followed his arrest, through the formal proceedings of the Leningrad Military District Tribunal. For women killed, 4 to 13 suspected, a soldier's uniform used as a key to unlock the trust of women at a checkpoint, a forest as a burial ground, a market in Viborg as the place where stolen lives were converted to pocket money. And then, on October 21, 1987, a firing squad in Leningrad. The end of Igor Shernat, the evil spirit of Cockjarvey, the Kamensky Maniac, 20 years old when he died, the same age as the sons the women had come to visit, the same age as the husbands the wives had crossed distances to see, the same age as the soldiers who stood in formation alongside him while the forest beyond the perimeter held its terrible inventory. The lake that carries his legacy in its name, Cockjarvey, still exists. The forest is still there. The village of Kamenka is still on the map. The 138th Guards Motor Rifle Brigade has its own history that extends far beyond the crimes of one of its most notorious conscripts. And the women who died there, Yevgenia, Victoria, Elena, the unnamed first victim, and perhaps others whose names were never formally attached to this case, remain exactly what they were when they arrived at that gate. People who came out of love and were destroyed by something that wore the face of duty. That is the story of Igor Chernat. Not a story of a supernatural force, not the work of a devil with cloven hooves and ancient malice. The work of a young man, born in Odessa, trained as a driver, drafted into the Soviet army, posted to a corrupt and poorly supervised military base in the Leningrad wilderness, and given, by accident, by institutional failure, by the trust of women who had every reason to believe they were safe. The opportunity to become something that the forests around Lake Kokjarvi will never fully forget. The evil spirit was never supernatural. It was human. That is the most frightening thing of all. Thank you for being here and joining us through these dark and captivating stories. If you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe, and share with anyone who loves a good mystery. Drop a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. I always love hearing where our true crime family is watching from around the world. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and never stop searching for the truth.